Okay, guys, we're starting our unit on learning. This is unit 7 for us. Learning is a relatively permanent change in an organism's behavior due to experience. Some people may say that nature's most important gift to us may be our adaptability, which is our capacity to learn new behaviors that enable us to cope with ever-changing experiences. We've talked about habituation before. Humans and other animals learn by association, and that idea goes back 2,000 years. Our mind naturally connects events that occur in sequence. And the events linked in associative learning may be two stimuli, as in classical conditioning, or a response and its consequences, as in operant conditioning. If a stimulus occurs repeatedly, our response may diminish. And in such cases, the organism habituates. And we've talked about habituation before. Remember the video with the scary ghost that pops out. And then in observational learning, we learn from others, from viewing others' experiences. And this is also called social learning. So operant conditioning is a type of learning in which behavior is strengthened if it's followed by a reinforcer, or diminished if it's followed by a punisher. Classical conditioning is the first kind of learning we're going to talk about in this video, and it's a type of learning in which one learns to link two or more stimuli and anticipate events. So, a graphic to show you classical conditioning. You have two related events, lightning and thunder. So, after repetition, eventually when we see lightning, we wince because we anticipate thunder. Operant conditioning: balance a ball, get food, so you want to balance the ball more. Or the seal does, at least. So let's talk about classical conditioning. Ivan Pavlov, explored this phenomenon that we call classical conditioning, and in which organisms learn to associate stimuli and anticipate events. And this laid the foundation for John B. Watson's behaviorism, which held that psychology should be an objective science that studies only observable behavior. Pavlov, there he is right there. He's just a really neat looking guy, isn't he? He was driven by a passion for research, and after setting aside his initial plan to follow his father into the actual Russian Orthodox priesthood, he received a medical degree at 33, and then he spent the next 2 decades studying the digestive system. This earned him Russia's first Nobel Peace Prize in 1904, but it was his novel experiments on learning to which he devoted the last 3 decades of his life, and that earned his place in history, we should say. He actually came across this new direction on an incidental observation. Without fail, putting food in a dog's mouth caused the animal to salivate. And moreover, the dogs began salivating not only to the taste of food, but also to the mere sight of food, or the food dish, or the person delivering the food, or even the sound of that person's approaching footsteps. And at first, Pavlov considered these psychic secretions an annoyance until he realized that they pointed to a simple but important form of learning. And what Pavlov would do would repeatedly present a neutral stimulus, such as a tone, just before an unconditioned stimulus, such as food. This triggered the unconditioned response of salivation. After several repetitions, the tone alone, which now had become the conditioned stimulus, began triggering a conditioned response, or salivation. Unconditioned means unlearned. Conditioned means learned. So, thus, a UR is an event that occurs naturally in response to some stimulus. A US is something that naturally and automatically triggers the unlearned response. A CS is an originally neutral stimulus that through learning comes to be associated with some unlearned response. And a CR is the learned response to the originally neutral but now conditioned stimulus. This is kind of a gross but funny chart. If the unconditioned stimulus is a kiss, then the unconditioned response is romantic arousal. Conditioned stimulus is onion breath, and you add that to the unconditioned stimulus, and you still get your same UR. And then eventually, with repetition, onion breath is going to cause romantic arousal. Disgusting. Responses are acquired, and that is they're initially learned best when the CS is presented half a second before the US. This finding demonstrates how classical conditioning is biologically adaptive because it helps organisms prepare for good or bad events. Higher order conditioning occurs when the conditioned stimulus from one conditioning procedure is paired with a new neutral stimulus, creating a second, often weaker conditioned stimulus. And this is also called second order conditioning. Extinction refers to the diminishing of a conditioned response when the conditioned stimulus occurs repeatedly without the unconditioned stimulus. Spontaneous recovery. Oh, I'm sorry, we'll get there. So, okay, when you have the CS plus the US, you're strengthening this relationship, and then if you're just giving the CS and you're not giving the US, then eventually extinction is going to happen. Spontaneous recovery is the reappearance after a pause of an extinguished conditioned response. Generalization is the tendency to respond to a stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus. And so, for example, part of the body that's stimulated, hind paw and thigh, you're going to get a really strong response, not so much front paw. Discrimination is a learned ability to distinguish between a CS and other irrelevant stimuli. And I love this little cartoon. Generalization can be adaptive because it extends a learned response to other stimuli in a given category. For example, fearing not only moving cars, but also moving trucks and motorcycles. Discrimination has an adaptive value because it limits our learned responses to appropriate stimuli. For example, fleeing from a guard dog, but not from a guide dog. Research indicates that for many animals, cognitive appraisals are important for learning. And that means that thoughts and perceptions are important to the conditioning process. For example, animals appear capable of learning when to expect a US. The more predictable the association between the CS and the US, the stronger the CR. For example, when repeatedly faced with traumatic events over which they have no control, people come to feel helpless, hopeless, and depressed. And psychologists call this passive resignation learned helplessness. The early behaviorist view that any natural response could be conditioned to a neutral stimulus has given way to the understanding that each species is biologically prepared to learn associations that enhance its survival. Thus, humans are likely to develop an aversion to the taste of a contaminated food, but not to the sight of an associated restaurant, its place, plates, or the music that they heard there. Similarly, rats develop aversions to taste, but not to sights or sounds. Organisms are predisposed to learn associations that help them adapt. The discovery of biological constraints affirms the value of different levels of analysis, including the biological and the cognitive. Pavlov taught us that principles of learning apply across species and that classical conditioning is one way that virtually all organisms learn to adapt to their environment. Pavlov also demonstrated that significant psychological phenomena can be studied objectively. Finally, Pavlov taught us that conditioning principles have important applications, such as how to treat fear. Classical conditioning principles promote important insights into drug abuse and how it may be overcome. Classical conditioning works on the body's disease-fighting immune system. For example, when a particular taste accompanies a drug that influences immune responses, the taste by itself may come to produce these immune responses. Watson's Little Albert study demonstrated how classical conditioning may underlie specific fears. And today, psychologists use extinction procedures or even new conditioning to change our unwanted responses to emotion-arousing stimuli. And that's it for video 1. Thanks, guys.